Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Shloshim commemoration of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. It was just 1 month ago that we learned the bitter and sad news of the passing of one of the greatest giants of our generation, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. I have to tell you that he was a rabbi's rabbi, and rabbis throughout the world look to him, his scholarship, his insights, and his learning for inspiration. A matter of fact, every Friday I have the custom of downloading his weekly Dvar Torah on the Torah portion. And when he passed away, I thought to myself, how will I manage without the weekly inspiration from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks? And when I went to his website the Friday after his passing, I was shocked to see a Dvar Torah on the Parsha from this year, 5781, from Rabbi Sacks. And then there was a note that said that Rabbi Sacks prepared an entire year's worth of Dvar Torahs ahead of time. And so every Friday since his passing, I've been reading his weekly inspiration that he prepared in advance. And it feels like he is speaking to us from heaven as he continues to inspire and guide tens of thousands of Jews around the world who would turn to him each and every week for inspiration. And now we could really recognize that his inspiration was divine even when he was on earth. And indeed, he is one of the four leading rabbis that has ever graced our generation. We at Palm Beach Synagogue were fortunate to have Rabbi Jonathan Sacks speak at our synagogue on 2 occasions. Once when we opened the synagogue in 2000 on the corner of County Road, and once on Thanksgiving just a couple of years ago. But I'll tell you the time that I appreciated his talk more than ever before. In Palm Beach, there is an organization called the Fellowship of Christians and Jews. And every year they have an annual dinner. And just 3 years ago, at their annual dinner, they brought out Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks to speak at the Breakers Hotel at the annual gala of the Fellowship of Christians and Jews. And I watched a room full of Jews and Christians listen to Rabbi Sacks' eloquent and inspiring words and receive a standing ovation. And that's where I saw Rabbi Sacks, not in front of a Jewish audience, but I saw the way he was able to reach into the souls of humanity, not just the Jewish people, but was able to elucidate the words of Torah and reach people across all faiths, all denominations. He was a voice for Judaism in the world. He was a paradigm of what it means to be an Or LaGoyim, a light unto the nations. So the nations of the world can look to the Torah, to the Jewish people for inspiration, for guidance, and for direction. I just want to share a little passage of Talmud, because on a Shloshim we're supposed to learn Torah for the elevation of the soul. And it's actually a passage that when Rabbi Sacks came to Palm Beach Synagogue in 2000, he shared this with me. He saw that I was a young rabbi starting out in the rabbinate, and he shared this particular passage of Talmud with me. So let me learn it inside. And this is in the Aliyat HaNeshama for Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Yaakov Zev Tzvi. May his neshama have an aliyah. And by learning Torah here tonight and discussing his life's work and committing to continue to learn his teachings that will inspire generations and generations to come, we bring aliyah to his neshama tonight in Shamayim in Gan Eden. And the Mishnah says as follows, and this is actually a teaching that we find in our prayers. It says, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Chananya. Rabbi Elazar says in the name of Rabbi Chananya, Talmidei Chachamim, Torah scholars, Marbim Shalom Ba'olam, increase peace in the world. Shenemar, as the verse says, V'chol banayach lemudei Hashem, that all your children are students of God, V'rav Shalom banayach, and there will be abundant peace for your children. So what do we see here? The verse says that those who study Torah, the children of God, bring abundant peace to the world. So Rabbi Elazar says in the name of Rabbi Chanina that Torah scholars increase peace in the world. Now, how do they increase peace in the world? First of all, by studying Torah, they make peace between one man and a fellow man. By adjudicating laws and governing disputes, they resolve conflicts through the Torah law and a bet din, and therefore they bring peace amongst people. But they also bring peace between man and God through the study of Torah and the teaching of Torah. But furthermore, the word shalom means peace, but also means completeness, which means they complete the world. Through their insights and depth of understanding of Torah, they reveal God's will in the world and complete the creation of the world. And as a result of that, they bring harmony and peace to the world because they are children of God who study the Torah. But then it goes on to say that the verse says the word your children twice. It says, V'chol banayach lemudei Hashem, all your children are students of God. V'rav shalom banayach, an abundant peace for your children. It could have just said the word children once. It could have said that V'chol banayach, all your children who study God's word will bring abundant peace. Why does it say banayach twice in the verse? And therefore the teaching goes on to say that al tikre banayach, that there's a double reading of the word. It can mean your children, but it could also mean bonayach, that your builders. That Torah scholars are not only bringing peace into the world, but they're actually building God's world through the study of Torah and the teaching of Torah. And the explanation of this Mishnah is that sometimes Torah scholars argue. If you study Talmud, study rabbinics, you know the rabbis are always arguing with one another. But since their disputes are for the sake of heaven, it's not to win the argument, but to find out God's will. And therefore, they don't create machlokes, but there's always peace and harmony between the scholars. And goes on to say that abundant peace for those who love your Torah, there will be no stumbling block before them. There will be peace in your gates and harmony in your homes. And finally, the Talmud concludes, for the sake of my brothers and friends, I seek peace. And for the sake of the house of Hashem, I seek good for my fellow man. And may God give strength to his nation. May God bless his nation, Israel, with peace. And when I think about Rabbi Sacks, I think about someone who brought peace to the world, who brought completeness to the world, who built the world through his Torah and through his insights. And he brought peace amongst Jews and brought peace amongst all of mankind through his many books and writings and teachings. But I just want to share with you what Rabbi Sacks shared with me when he came here. And as I said, he was a rabbi's rabbi, so he was always giving instruction to help other rabbis, to train rabbis. And the Lubavitch Rebbe once told him to go out and teach rabbis. And that was part of his rabbinic mission, to train and teach other rabbis. And he said to me, you know, sometimes being a rabbi puts you in a position of conflict. So how do you create peace as a Torah scholar? And he said the key is that you can't just be a teacher of Torah, you have to be a builder of Torah. If you build community and you build Torah institutions, then you create true peace and harmony in the community. And so it's truly our honor to remember a man of such stature, of such greatness. And Rabbi Sacks would often say that good leaders create followers, but great leaders create leaders. Rabbi Sacks would always inspire us to become the best we can be, to be leaders for our fellow Jews, to inspire others, and to realize that all of us are really ambassadors of Hashem, ambassadors of the Torah, ambassadors of Judaism, to be that light unto the nation, as Rabbi Sacks, with his humility, his kindness, his compassion, and his depth of knowledge and insight into Torah, was able to elucidate the peaceful, pleasant, harmonious ways of the Torah. Tonight, we have with us not only a great scholar, but a very close personal friend of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, our very own member, Paul Shaviv, who will talk to us about his relationship with Rabbi Sacks that has spanned many decades, and give us some insights into his life, into his persona, and to his life's accomplishments. And following Paul Shaviv's address, which will be about a half hour, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. So if you have questions, you can type them into the chat box, or you can present them afterwards, and we will present them to Paul Shaviv to answer. Paul Shaviv is semi-retired and works as an educational consultant in Florida and New York. He holds a BA and an MA degrees in architecture from Cambridge and a master's in medieval and modern Jewish studies from Oxford. He has occupied senior positions in 5 Jewish schools on 3 continents, and in 2009 was awarded the Max M. Fisher Prize for Excellence in Jewish Education. Paul is a frequent speaker and teaches Jewish history at Palm Beach Synagogue and Lincoln Square Synagogue in Manhattan. He and his wife, Michelle Stein Shaviv, are active members and supporters of Palm Beach Synagogue. It is a pleasure and an honor to introduce to you our guest speaker tonight, a scholar and personal friend of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, Paul Shaviv.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Scheiner. I hope everyone can hear me. Yeah, good. First of all, I want to thank Rabbi Scheiner for the considerable honor in inviting me to talk about John Sacks. This is a very, very difficult talk for me to give for several reasons. First of all, just the emotion of it. Rabbi Sacks and his wife, Elaine, have been close personal friends of mine for 55 years, I suppose. Secondly, the enormity of the man and his works, which have become so apparent in the last few weeks, means that there is a mountain of information to deal with. So I'm going to talk about reflections and memories a little bit, memories. But even those who knew him and knew him well are reeling at the tsunami of tributes and the quality of the tributes and the origins of those tributes that have been expressed all over the world in the last few weeks. It is appropriate, but somewhat risky, to utilize the image of a palm tree here in Palm Beach, where anyone can check out the analogy. But in Psalm 92, Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, we read, Tzadik katama yifrach, the righteous person will flourish like a palm tree. And there's a well-known homily on that phrase, which says, what does that mean? A Hasidic commentator says that the crown of a palm tree obscures its real height because of all the leaves, the foliage at the top. You can't really see how tall the trunk is. And you can only measure it truly when it's cut down, when it falls. And so it is with Rabbi Sacks, because whatever our estimation of his greatness was, it has been stunning and staggering to listen to the online tributes over the last few weeks. I think that every Jewish community in the world has put on a memorial program to Rabbi Sacks. Just in the last 24 hours since Motzai Shabbat, since Shabbat finished yesterday, and the Shloshim began, I've watched programs from YU, from the Koren Publishing House, which was his publishing house, which was really fascinating about how he approached texts and translated them, and what his philosophy of translation was. A particularly interesting program was from the Israeli newspaper Makor Rishon, which has a podcast, and anyone who understands Ivrit should look up Makor Rishon. It's easy to locate the program, because that gave an Israeli perspective on Rabbi Sacks. And of course, earlier today, many of you may have seen the quote marks official 1.5 hour program of tributes that his own office put on the occasion of his Shloshim. And that, of course, was distinguished by the fact that none other than Prince Charles himself, and I'll come back to this, gave about a 10-minute tribute, which is, believe me, unprecedented in British public life. So reflections and memories, and let me deal with some memories first. As I said, I've known Jonathan Sacks since we were both 14. We didn't go to the same high schools, but we hung out in the same neighborhood. But we both overlapped as students. We were students together at Cambridge University at the end of the 1960s. He was a year ahead of me. But even then, it was clear to everyone, even in Cambridge, that here was an outstanding mind, a truly outstanding mind. John was, of course, part of the Jewish Society at Cambridge, the group of Jewish students who met daily for minyan and for meals, kosher meals at the small Cambridge synagogue. But we were all in awe of him, even then. He was studying philosophy and he would engage us in the philosophical problems of Jewish belief, especially orthodoxy, even at that time. But he wasn't the committed person that he later became. We had, as part of our society Hillel program, a succession of guest speakers, all of whom found themselves, occasionally to their discomfort, in very earnest dialogue with this softly spoken student who would pose them questions that many of them, just couldn't answer. His philosophical mentor at the time was the leading Cambridge philosopher, Bernard Williams. Bernard Williams, who of course was not Jewish, was the professor of philosophy. He was a militant atheist, but in the true British tradition, he was extremely tolerant of his star pupils' interest in Jewish orthodoxy. Jonathan Sacks was regarded as the brightest philosophy student of the decade in Cambridge. And that, believe me, is no mean distinction. John at that point was still not quite yet into full Jewish observance, although he was, orthoprax. He came from a traditional suburban Jewish family in northwest London. On his father's side, he came from second generation Russian Polish immigrants to London, like many of us. But on his mother's side, he came from a well-known Eastern European rabbinic family and religious Zionist pioneers, the Frumkin family, who were among the founders of Petach Tikva. One branch had come to London and established a business importing the first Israeli, or as it was known then, Palestinian wines. And all of London made, in fact, all of England made Kiddush on what we call Palwyn, Palestinian wine, on Palwyn wines supplied by Jonathan Sacks's grandfather and great-grandfather. But many of them were also scholars, and I remember him taking me once to the Cambridge University Library, which in those days, pre-computers, everything was still on card indexes. The catalog was still card index, and he pulled out the shelf with F for Frumkin and showed me the wad of index cards that contained the catalog, the books, and I think manuscripts as well of his family. At Cambridge, John met his wife, Elaine, who is absolutely charming and who throughout his life has been his absolutely invaluable Eshes Chayil. Elaine also came from a suburban London Jewish family. She was studying radiology at the famous Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge. And we spent countless nights drinking strong black coffee and arguing about Martin Buber and George Scheiner and Emil Fackenheim and the other Jewish thinkers of the 60s and 70s. But as has been related, it all changed in the summer of, I think must have been 1970 or 71, when Jonathan bought a Greyhound bus ticket and set off on his marathon journey across the United States to meet America's Jewish thinkers. You need to understand, why did he have to do this? That in those pre-internet days, England was a Jewish wilderness. You could barely buy even a Jewish book in England at the time. The community was still in the Victorian age, There was no Jewish faculty or Jewish studies to speak of in Cambridge. And the community itself was no help. The newly arrived Immanuel Jakobowitz, who arrived in England in 1967, was trying to drag it into the 20th century. And when he arrived in America, John met a series of individual rabbis. He was originally, and I remember him telling me about it, he was just blown away, put off by the great J.B. Soloveitchik, with whom he had an appointment. And he said, I got to the top floor of the Yeshiva University building where we were meant to meet, whatever time it was. And the doors of the elevator opened and Rabbi Soloveitchik walked out. He said, and I was so scared and put off by the coldness of those gray eyes that I turned around and I missed the appointment. And I had to go back a day or so later with some excuse. But he had exactly the opposite experience when he met the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson. In those days, you could still get one-on-one meetings, which are known in Chabad as Yechidus, with the Rebbe. Nowadays, I think, well, not nowadays, but later it became impossible as the Rebbe's fame spread. I actually missed Yechidus by 10 minutes because a couple of years later, I was in New York and I left where I was staying to go to the airport. And I was told that the phone call came from the Rebbe's office 10 minutes later with a time. So had I been 10 minutes later, who knows how my life would have been different. My wife looks appalled the other side of the room. But the Rebbe captured Jonathan Sacks in the best possible way, because every question that John asked him was thrown back at him as a personal challenge. John said, what can I do about Jewish life in Cambridge? And the Rebbe said to him, what do you mean? Why are you asking me? I'm asking you, what can you do? What are you going to do about it? And Jonathan's reply was, well, and this is famous, he wrote about it. Jonathan's reply was, well, in the situation in which I find myself, and the Rebbe interrupted him and said, no one finds themselves in a situation. You put yourself in a situation. As a result of this long conversation, this deep, rational, ultra-rational Cambridge philosopher became not a Chabadnik, but a personal chassid, a personal follower of the Rebbe's. And for years afterwards, he would ask the Rebbe's advice on every stage of his career. I remember when the issue of the chief rabbinate came up, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, Jonathan wrote to the Rebbe a letter and he said, dear Rebbe XYZ, my name is being put forward for this position. Should I allow my name to go forward? And I happened to be in his house, in his apartment at the time, when the reply from the Rebbe arrived. He opened the envelope, and in the letter where he'd written, should I allow my name to go forward, the Rebbe had photocopied it. He just put the printer's mark of reversing. Those of you who know used to have printer's marks. There's a printer's mark for reversing the order of two words, so that it read, I should allow my name to go forward. That was the totality of the Rebbe's reply. Under the influence of the Rebbe, when John graduated Cambridge, he went to study in Kfar Chabad for several months. And that was where he was really inducted into Chassidut, into the mysteries of Chassidism, into the depth of Chassidism. And although he, in later years, did not identify himself as a Chassid, he was always very, very, very ready to admit to the influence of Chassidut, of Chassidus, particularly Chabad Chassidus, on him. And I remember clearly when he returned from Kfar Chabad and he turned up in Cambridge to a somewhat apprehensive Elaine. He was heavily bearded and he had on a large black hat. His tutor, Bernard Williams, the philosopher, on seeing him said jokingly but tolerantly, "Ah, I see you've escaped from the magic circle," which was not a very nice thing to say, but it was meant in the best of words. At that point, John decided to become a rabbi. He and Elaine married shortly afterwards. I had the pleasure and indeed the honor of writing and decorating their ketubah, which still hangs in their house. And for a year or so, he combined rabbinical study with a lectureship in philosophy at a local college in London. But then he soon became a full-time student at the London Orthodox Rabbinical Seminary, known as Jews College. Rabbi Jacobowitz, Chief Rabbi Jacobowitz, had inherited Jews College at a time when it had just undergone crisis and trauma, following something called the Jacobs Affair, which I'm not going to go into, but there had been a community-wide crisis about the leadership of the college, which had resulted in many resignations of both faculty and leadership, and the college was in a terrible state. Jacobowitz invited a world-class Talmid Chacham, Rabbi Eliezer Rabinovich. Do I have Eliezer? Sorry, Rabbi Nachum Rabinovich. Rabbi Nachum Rabinovich to head the college, came actually from Toronto. Rabbi Rabinovich was a world-class Talmid Chacham, a posek, a decisor in Jewish law, and he was a full-time lecturer apart from being a rabbi, at the University of Waterloo in mathematical statistics, a particularly arcane area, and he'd written an incomprehensible book on mathematical probability and statistics in the Talmud. Somebody said to me that there were only 3 other people in the entire world who can understand it, and they weren't even sure about them. But Nachum Rabinovich stayed in the United Kingdom in London for 10 years, which were utterly miserable for him. He never managed to make a success of the college, and he never really related. He was a very quiet, shy man who was an academic, and he never really integrated in the Anglo-Jewish community. And when he left London after 10 years, he went to be the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Birkat Moshe in Ma'aleh Adumim in Jerusalem, just outside Jerusalem. He died only a few months ago, I think in May. And he was regarded as a world-class scholar, and in particular, he was probably the world authority on Maimonides, on the Rambam. But only one thing kept him in England for 10 years, and that was Jonathan Sacks, who was his star pupil and protege. And he recognized that in Jonathan Sacks, he had a brilliant Ilui, brilliant, outstanding student. After 9 years, Jonathan took up a rabbinic post in synagogue in Golders Green. And then eventually himself, a few years later, was appointed after a certain interim, he was appointed the head of Jews College himself. But we fast forwarded until 1990, when Emanuel Jacobowitz was ready to retire. Who was going to succeed Emanuel Jacobowitz? And how did Jonathan Sacks, who at the time was in his early 40s, become chief rabbi? There were 2 obvious candidates. One of them was Rabbi Cyril Harris. Cyril Harris had been a hugely popular rabbi in London for many years. He was actually born in Scotland, and his initials were C.K. Harris. And to give you some idea of how assimilated the Anglo-Jewish community was at the time, It is a little known fact that the K stood for Kitchener. His parents named him Kitchener in honor of the British colonial military hero. So one was Rabbi Harris. He had been a rabbi in London. As a strategic move, he'd gone to South Africa where he was chief rabbi, reckoning correctly that it would be easier for him to move back from South Africa as chief rabbi to be chief rabbi of England than to move from a suburban synagogue to be chief rabbi. He was really the front runner. But there was an Anglo-Jewish industrialist / philanthropist called Stanley Kalms, whose family had Chabad connections. Stanley Kalms decided that Jonathan Sacks represented the future hope of the Anglo-Jewish community. That as someone who was young, brilliant, and able to speak the intellectual language, Harris had many, many talents. He was a wonderful community rabbi. He was nowhere near the same intellectual stature as John, and he knew it. He never pretended to be. But Stanley Kalms decided that Jonathan Sacks could bring back to the Anglo-Jewish community the young intellectuals and others who were deserting the dated and stagnant United Synagogue. The United Synagogue in England is the Orthodox umbrella body of middle-of-the-road Orthodox shuls. It's fascinating to me at least, because I lived through all of this and I knew everyone involved. That at the time, no one mentioned or foresaw the fact that Jonathan Sacks might also speak to the non-Jewish, broader English public. No, it just was not on the agenda, no one thought about it. Stanley Kalms, who was a very successful businessman and a no-nonsense businessman, mounted a campaign. He set up an office, he employed a PR company, and he marketed Jonathan Sacks over a period of about 2 years. And he eventually, the post of chief rabbi was elected by a council of lay leadership representing synagogues in London and around England. And at the election, Jonathan Sacks was successful. In one of the Shloshim meetings that I referred to, actually, a very good podcast put on by YU, by Yeshiva University. The interviewer asks the guy called Daniel Reinhold, who was being interviewed about Jonathan Sacks, what was it about the Anglo-Jewish community that produced a Jonathan Sacks? Yeah, what were how could they have done it? And Reinhold said, good question, I don't really know. If you go on the website, you'll see that I put in a comment underneath the lecture, which Reinhold also wrote afterwards. This is a very perceptive comment, I agree with you. And it was that Jonathan Sacks was not a product of the Anglo-Jewish community. He was not. Because if you look at who were his influences, one major influence was Bernard Williams, his Cambridge philosophy tutor. By the way, Jonathan Sacks did not ever go to a Jewish school. He went to Christ's College, Finchley, work it out. So his number one influence was Bernard Williams, the non-Jewish philosophy don. Number two was Menachem Mendel Schneerson, certainly not Anglo-Jewish in any way, shape or form. And Anglo-Jewry then, one of the reasons that they were the Anglo-Jewish establishment was very suspicious of Rabbi Sacks was his Chabad connection. The third influence on him was Nachum Rabinovich, again, a complete outsider to the community. And the fourth influence was Stanley Kalms. Stanley Kalms, although British, was an outsider to the community whose avowed aim was actually to dismantle it and rebuild it from the beginning. So Jonathan was not a product of Anglo Jewry, he was an outsider. And to a degree, although I don't really have time to talk about it, to a degree, even throughout his chief rabbinate, he was not quite an insider. He was still something of an outsider. But let's pause for a moment and consider who was this young man who became, at the age of, what was he, 42, 43, the chief rabbi of the grandly named chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the British Commonwealth. Actually, in practice, chief rabbi of 60 London synagogues and another 15 or 20 provincial synagogues. When you look today, and I mean today, at the video clips which were part of the official Shloshim program, and by the way, I would urge everyone, if you have a chance, go online. It's easy to find, rabbisachs.org/Shloshim, SHLOSHIM, and you'll see the 1.5 hour program that was broadcast earlier today in his memory. But when you look at some of the clips of him in action in that program, there are two of them, I think, 2 or 3 of him addressing vastly different audiences. One of them is him addressing 3,000 or 4,000 Chabad Shluchim, Chabad emissaries, at the huge annual Chabad gathering in New York about, I think it was about 6 or 7 years ago. And here you see a master of communication and of public speaking. He is moderate, his voice is fabulous. His body language is fabulous. He's waving his arms and he's encouraging everyone, and he's just a master. The second, a completely different audience, is his TED Talk from a few years back. I think probably everyone knows what TED Talks are. But here he was addressing the TED Talk audience in exactly the same. Masterly oratory, masterly body language. But the truth is, it didn't come easily or naturally to him. Because when he began, those 2 performances are unrecognizable from his initial years as chief rabbi. In the videos, he is fabulous. And in fact, the originator of the TED Talk platforms, who figures in the tributes to him, said he was a rabbi. I didn't know what to expect. I was very apprehensive. But do you understand that his TED Talk had now had more than 2 million views? Is there another rabbi on the face of the earth who, number 1, would be invited to give a TED Talk, and number 2, would have, or has had in any connection, 2 million views? I don't think so. But his oratory was electrifying, his body language was riveting. There was no hint of the awkward, shy, stiff personality who became chief rabbi in 1992. My late wife, Judy, Aleha Shalom, who passed away quite a number of years ago, was actually his private and personal secretary and set up his office in London when he became chief rabbi. And I remember in the first 3 or 4 weeks of his chief rabbinate, she came home, like that, because he had given his office a program of a synagogue visit, one of the earliest synagogue visits he was going to make, which was to a tiny community called Staines in the west of London. Staines Jewish community would make Palm Beach Synagogue look like, I know, the main synagogue in Tel Aviv. And he said, he put down there the theme of his drosha, of his sermon. And it was going to be a comparison between the philosophy of Wittgenstein and the philosophy of the Rambam. Not suitable. Yeah, you cannot go to a tiny suburban synagogue and talk about Wittgenstein and the Rambam. You know, who is this Mr. Wittgenstein? I've never heard of him. Whatever. He accepted very quickly that he needed to work on all of this. And quietly, in the first couple of years of his chief rabbinate, he had extensive and intensive coaching, public speaking, in interpersonal contact, interpersonal relations, from the top professionals in Great Britain. He worked hard at learning how to be a public figure, and it completely transformed him. And it's a tribute to his seriousness that he understood what he had to do, and he went at it and he did it. Jonathan Sacks became not just a Jewish leader, but he became a national leader in Britain. When he was made a lord, and I don't think anyone has pointed this out in the obituaries, to get into the House of Lords, there are 2 or 3 different ways. One way is to be the son of a lord, or the son of an earl, or the son of a duke, and inherit your place in the House of Lords. In the last few years, that has been somewhat, well, not somewhat, it's been drastically pruned. It's not so easy. Number 2 is which is the way that most people become lords, is to be appointed by one of the main political parties. Every year, the main political parties have the privilege or the prerogative of nominating people to go into the House of Lords. And they normally nominate their own members as sort of a, as a retirement present. But there's a third way, which is very rare. And it's only 3 or 4 people a year, I think, if that. And that is a nomination by a special committee purely on your status or importance as a national figure of great importance who can contribute to the House of Lords. And Jonathan was nominated under that provision. Really, really rare. And I think the person who summed up his status as a national figure most concisely was actually the new Israeli ambassador to London, an Israeli politician called Tzipi Hotovely, quite a controversial appointment. But one of the programs that was online today was, I think I mentioned it, was by Makor Rishon, an Israeli newspaper. And they interviewed, she was part of it as the Israeli ambassador to London. They asked her in Ivrit, what's your impression? And she said, look, I arrived in London only a few weeks ago, and sadly, I never had a chance to meet Rabbi Sacks. She said, but when he passed away, I suddenly found not only was the Jewish community in mourning, but the entire British nation was in mourning. She said every newspaper, every television station, every radio program led with the news of the passing of Rabbi Sacks. And in fact, on a couple of days afterwards, he passed away on a Shabbat morning. On the Monday, Prime Minister Boris Johnson opened Prime Minister's question time and said, before I do anything else, I want to pay tribute to the passing of former Chief Rabbi, Lord Jonathan Sacks. Unprecedented, just unprecedented. What were his attributes? His first attribute was that he had a world-class brain. When I say that, I don't mean that he was just brilliant. I mean that he had a world-class brain of the, Bertrand Russell, Chomsky, Steiner, Einstein, any of these people. Jonathan Sacks had a brilliant analytical brain. He was, by the way, awarded 18 honorary PhDs. Again, I don't think there's another rabbi in the entire world who's ever been awarded 18 honorary PhDs by universities. As I said, he was the philosophy student of the decade in Cambridge. I once saw an informal demonstration of his brilliance, and it was while he was just starting out as a rabbinic student. So he didn't have advanced rabbinic knowledge at that point. But he and I went on a Shabbat afternoon to hear a London rabbi called Isaac Bernstein give his Shabbat Hagadol drasha, his Shabbat Hagadol sermon. And Bernstein was a very flowery, fiery character, and he was also a great Talmid Chacham. He also unfortunately passed away at a tragically early age. And we sat in the synagogue with 400 or 500 other people and heard Bernstein give his Shabbat Hagadol drasha. Like everyone else, after about the first 3 minutes, I lost track completely of what he was saying, and I sat back and enjoyed the fireworks because they were rabbinic fireworks. But when we left the shul, Jonathan looked at me and said, you know, I understand he said this, and he went through 15 or 20 stages of the argument that we just heard. And then he said, but his jump from point 6 to point 7, that was a logical mistake. And he analyzed the logical mistakes. Not only did he remember it, but he could analyze it as well. He was a brilliant communicator, also particularly on media. As I said, he learned how to do it. He had a wonderful radio voice, actually. In Britain, there is something called Thought for the Day, which is a 4-minute, hold on. Rabbi, I'm going over time, but I hope you all forgive me. There's something called Thought for the Day, which is a 4-minute sort of slot on BBC radio every morning after the 8 o'clock news. And it's given every day by somebody different. Jonathan was a star performer on Thought for the Day. And if you look in the UK papers and you see the comments, person after person starts off by saying, I am Christian, I'm not Jewish, but he was the greatest teacher of spirituality on Thought for the Day, and I never missed one. Over and over and over again. He was the teacher, advisor, and spiritual personality and guide to prime ministers, to archbishops, to presidents of Europe, to politicians, to the great and the good and the mighty. At his retirement party in 2013, his retirement party in 2013, there were tributes from 4 British prime ministers, 3 archbishops of Canterbury and a Roman Catholic archbishop, and the guest of honor was the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles. There is no other person in British public life who has ever attracted that sort of appreciation and tribute. And if you look at, again, if you look at the tribute online by Prince Charles, broadcast today by his office, you'll see that Prince Charles is just incredible in his praise and appreciation of Jonathan Sacks, and introduces quite a number of Hebrew phrases probably learned for the occasion into his tribute. He was a rabbi's rabbi. He nurtured, actually Rabbi Scheiner referred to this. He nurtured and encouraged young rabbis. Tribute after tribute said it. He had phenomenal energy and self-discipline. He wrote 36 books, 36 books. And again, as I said, he was a national leader when the Pope visited England a decade or more ago when he was still chief rabbi. There was a big question, who was going to greet the Pope on behalf of the religious communities of Britain? The Archbishop of Canterbury, the Catholic cardinal, since it was the Pope? No. The archbishops, the bishops, the cardinals got together And they decided unanimously that their spokesman would be Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Chief Rabbi, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. And it was he who greeted the Pope on behalf of Britain. His Jewish philosophy was directed at the individual Jew. His famous book, A Letter in the Scroll, said that if one letter in a Sefer Torah is missing or is not there in one way or another, the whole Sefer Torah is invalid. Same with the Jewish people. If there is one Jew missing, the whole of the Jewish people is harmed. And that was his constant message in one way or another. But then he moved on. Well, he didn't move on, as well as addressing Jewish community problems. He emerged as Britain's foremost social and religious philosopher. And many of his later books, particularly after he retired as chief rabbi, addressed universal problems, religion and violence, religion and science. His latest book, published only a few weeks ago, Morality, about the universal value of morality. He proposed religion as the essential glue for civilized society. And he became a fixture on the national media. After he retired in 2013, he made a conscious decision to utilize online and social media. And he now has had a huge presence on online and social media, rabbisacks.org. His weekly Covenant and Conversation reaches tens of thousands of people. He started spending time in North America. He was a visiting professor in several universities. And he also started collaboration with the Koren publishing house in Israel, where he published the Sidurim with a beautiful, beautiful, elegant English translation and commentary. Far superior, I'm not going to mention names of others, but far superior to anything else on the market. He published Makazorim Festival prayer books for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, I think Pesach, Sukkot, and Shavuot are out now. And Koren has announced that coming is a 1-volume Chumash with his translation and commentary. And that will be an incredible, incredible milestone. There was some discussion and not very clear about whether the project had been finished, but Koren announced that the complete book is actually at the printers and will be available in the coming months. He never lost sight of his Jewish mission. He made a few mistakes as chief rabbi in his earlier years, some political mistakes. He was completely ignored, unfortunately, by the Haredi world, who completely distrusted the very thing which made him successful with every other constituency, i.e., his astonishing ability to span both the Torah world and have a complete command of Western culture. As he called it, Torah v'chokhmah, Torah and wisdom. His Torah commentaries swing from the most obscure rabbinic and Hasidic sources to the comparisons of Western writers, poets, sociologists, and philosophers. It's very interesting that only now is he beginning to be known in Israel, and many of the tributes to him from Israeli sources have one or two themes. Number one, we need rabbis like him in Israel. Number two, it's impossible for us to produce them because the system doesn't allow for non-political rabbis, and it doesn't allow for rabbis who also have a broader Western cultural knowledge. It's fascinating to look at the Makor Rishon and listen to the tributes from people like Lapid, the head of the Israeli, one of the Israeli secular, Kachol Lavan, the Israeli secular political party, who refers to him as my rabbi, my Rebbe. Jonathan Sacks was a unique individual and a unique rabbi in our times. Unlike many others, he did not leave his Judaism behind at the door. He used his unique gifts entirely, they say in Hebrew, lahagdil Torah or laha'adira, to magnify Torah and to enhance it. Yehi zichro baruch, may his memory be for a blessing. I'd be very happy to take any discussion, questions, queries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, for that very broad overview and very insightful overview of Rabbi Sacks's life, which covered so much. It was really a pleasure to be able to hear from you, from someone who knew him firsthand. For anyone who has a question, just post it in the chat box. But I would like to start with the first question, Paul, and that is, I remember when Rabbi Sacks came to Palm Beach Synagogue in 2000, and
I wasn't there, but carry on. Yeah.
The impression I got when I met him was that he was somewhat of an introvert, like a shy person. But then when he got up to speak, it was like this lion, this powerful, powerful personality. It was almost like a different person than in a social setting. Could you tell us a little bit about him? Would you describe him as being shy or introverted? And how did he come that to be such a powerful leader?
Well, I think there are two things here. Number one, he had an incredible power of concentration. And whenever you saw him and he was preparing to do something or say something, he would, his brow would furrow. And there was this, you could almost hear him concentrating. I mean, so he appeared often to be introverted and withdrawn. Number one. Number two, there were definitely elements of that in his personality. As I mentioned, even when he began his chief rabbinate, he was very stiff and not at all at ease meeting people or small talk, or the equivalent, whatever the rabbinic equivalent of patting babies on the head is for politicians, right? He just couldn't do it, and he worked on it. He worked on it so hard, and he became outstanding at it, which I think was a tribute to his powers of concentration and his self-realization, self-awareness. Yeah.
Another thing that strikes you when you listen to Rabbi Sacks is his great sense of humor. He loved to tell a joke. He was very witty, of course. He always found a clever quip to make about something. I have a member of our shul who also goes to Fifth Avenue Synagogue, and Rabbi Sacks, as you said, spent some time lecturing at Yeshiva University, and he spoke as a scholar in residence at Fifth Avenue, and he opened up his talk by saying, at the Fifth Avenue Synagogue, this is the first time, the Sacks on Fifth Avenue, like he always had something funny to say. Did you see that sense of humor in him back in the Cambridge days?
Nope. No, not at all. Something else I think he learned as a necessary technique. And I think also, to be fair, his wife, Elaine, had a wonderful influence on him. I mean, Elaine is a fabulous person who is totally down to earth, totally sensible. And she probably said to him, Jonathan, you have to start with a joke. I don't care what else you say, start with a joke. And he did it. And by, I suppose after a time it came naturally.
Right. I also know he had a great love of music. He actually produced some clips of songs, Oseh Shalom, and other things that he would sing with the children. Tell us about his musical abilities or background.
Actually, I think he appreciated music. He listened to a huge amount of music, and he loved music. I don't think he could play any instrument, as far as I know. I may be wrong, but I don't think so. But he loved music, all sorts of music, and literally all sorts of music, from pop music to, Mahler and Wagner and the really deep classical composers. And he loved Hasidic nigunim. He loved Hasidic music and Hasidic nigunim. And there's again, a famous BBC program called Desert Island Discs, where you have to, choose 8 records that you take with you if you're on a desert island. And one of them that he chose was the Chabad tune Tzoma Tzoma Nafshi, which was the first and only time it's ever featured on desert island discs. We have some questions, Rabbi, if so do you want me to address those?
Sure.
Yeah.
I don't see questions. Where are the questions?
They're probably directly to me. So they're on my question thing. So let's have a look and see what we have. Okay, from Eddie and Yael. Rabbi said, how did he manage his work, public life with his personal life? He was a devoted family man, and I think he sometimes felt he would have liked to have spent more time with his kids, which is common to many public figures, but his children were devoted to him. How did he manage his work public life with his personal life? He was very, very, very organized. As I think I mentioned, he had strict discipline. He had time set aside for writing, time set aside for reading, and he was highly, highly, highly organized. And he had an office that kept him organized as well, that would organize his time months in advance, literally. Personal note, what do you do when you miss him? I think you can log into his website, and there are many videos, many talks, and many of his writings. He encouraged, Tina points out that his daughter, one of his daughters, thanked her father for teaching her to think for herself. And that was something that he was very, very insistent on. He did not want everyone to follow party lines. He insisted that people should, try and, should try and work things out for themselves and do their own reading and their own thought and their own research and follow their own teachers. Palm Beach Synagogue, I don't know whether that's the rabbi or whether it's Myra or somebody. How's Paul's relationship with Judaism evolved over the years, given the friendship with Rabbi Sachs? I don't think I'm going to answer that. Thank you very much. Thanks, but no thanks. Okay. There's no doubt that anyone who knew him had to have been impacted just by the majesty and the power and the dignity of this man's personality. I mean, he really was an inspiration to many, many, many people. Yeah.
It came as a shock to most of us when we heard of his passing. I guess we didn't realize how grave the situation was. We knew that he was ill. We were saying to Hillel, did it come as a shock to you, or were you aware of how serious the situation was?
Okay. Sorry, go on.
Or was it unexpected, premature?
Okay, Jonathan, I think it's been said publicly, so I don't mind saying it. Jonathan had 2 previous bouts with cancer many years ago. Once when he was in his 30s and once when he was in his, about 20 years ago when he was in his 50s. And obviously it was he didn't talk about it, it was in remission and whatever. So this was fairly clearly a recurrence of an earlier, of earlier cancer. I intuited that something was wrong when he withdrew from public life, I think in late August, something like that. August, maybe even late, maybe later, maybe October. Whenever it was, I think it was clear that we were not in a good place because there were no bulletins, etc., 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 etc. Interestingly, I think it was on the Koren Publishing Group's tribute online. One of the people that he worked with on translations and on his books said that they believe that he hinted to them some months ago that he knew that he was getting ill again. So, but look, it was clearly very quick, and it was clearly premature, and it is a great tragedy.
Yeah, it's a loss that will be felt by the entire Jewish people. Yeah. And that Yehei Zichro Baruch Hashem, he was so forward-thinking and innovative in his writings and podcasts, and there's a wealth, a mountain, like you said, of materials that we can continue to learn and be inspired by his teachings. And he was almost like an entrepreneur. He was always looking for the next, most innovative way to spread Judaism, and every new means of spreading Torah, and it's quite remarkable.
But if I may, I would just add something to what you just said. It's not only that he will be missed by the Jewish community. You have to go online and listen to, the Archbishop of Canterbury talking about the personal loss that he feels with Jonathan's passing. Listen to Prince Charles talking about the personal loss that he feels. Listen to former Prime Ministers Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, listening to their sense of absolute personal loss, because he really did impact way, way, way beyond the Jewish community as a spiritual guide and a spiritual educator and a spiritual leader.
Well, thank you, Paul, for this very beautiful presentation you gave us tonight. And we gather here tonight for the Ilui Nishmasa. May his neshama continue to rise higher as we learn his Torah and be inspired by his ways. V'alachta, to go in the ways of Hashem as he inspired us to all do, and to make a Kiddush Hashem. He personified sanctification of God's name through his deeds, through his words, through his actions. And may we all aspire to do the same.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much. Good night.
All the best.